In the middle of a dusty village square near Kisii, Joy Kwamboka stood alone, her hands trembling over the curve of her pregnant belly. Voices surrounded her like stones being thrown. "Shameless girl," one woman shouted. "You have cursed this village," another cried. The village elder Mazi Otieno lifted his staff and pointed toward the road. "Leave before your child brings disgrace to us all." Joy's tears fell silently onto the red earth. Then suddenly, the low rumble of engines broke the chaos. 3 black luxury SUVs rolled slowly into the square. A tall man stepped out. He walked straight toward Joy and said something that made the entire village fall silent. Before we continue, tell us in the comments which country you're watching from and what time it is there right now. And if stories about courage, justice, and unexpected kindness move your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Long before the day the village gathered to shame her, Joy Kwamboka had been known for something very different. In the small hills outside Kisii, Kenya, people once spoke of her with warmth. "She is a good girl," the older women used to say. Hard-working like her mother. Joy's life had never been easy, but it had always been honest. She lived in a small mud-walled house with a rusted iron roof at the edge of the village with her mother Mama Nyambura. Their home sat near a narrow dirt path where children passed every morning on their way to school, and where farmers carried baskets of bananas, cassava, and maize toward the market. The house was small, 2 rooms and a cooking corner outside, but it had always been filled with laughter. Mama Nyambura had raised Joy alone since Joy was 7 years old. Her father had died after a sudden illness, leaving the family with almost nothing but debts and grief. From that moment, Joy grew up quickly. While other children played after school, Joy helped her mother in the shamba, digging rows of vegetables and carrying water from the river in the yellow jerry cans. By the time she turned 17, she was already selling roasted maize and sukuma wiki at the village market. And she did it with pride. People liked buying from Joy's stall. She greeted every customer with a warm smile and called the elderly women Shosho with genuine respect. When children passed by without money, she sometimes slipped them a roasted cob of maize anyway. Mama Nyambura used to watch her from a distance, her tired eyes soft with pride. "My daughter," she would say quietly, "your kindness will bring you blessings one day." For many years it seemed that might be true. Then Brian Uma came into Joy's life. Brian arrived in the village riding a bright red Boda Boda motorcycle taxi. He was tall, confident, and full of laughter. Unlike the quiet farmers who had lived in the village for generations, Brian carried the energy of someone who had seen bigger towns and busier roads. Young women noticed him immediately. But Brian noticed Joy. At first it was small things. He began stopping near her vegetable stall after dropping off passengers. He would remove his helmet, wipe the sweat from his forehead, and buy roasted maize even when he clearly wasn't hungry. "Your maize is the best in Kisii," he would tease. Joy would laugh and shake her head. "You say that every day." "Because it's true every day," Brian would reply with a grin. Slowly, their conversations grew longer. Sometimes Brian stayed after the market closed, helping Joy carry her baskets home along the dusty path. Other evenings they sat outside her house while Mama Nyambura prepared tea over the charcoal stove. Mama Nyambura liked Brian at first. He spoke respectfully and called her Mama. He talked about dreams of opening a transport company one day, owning several motorcycles, maybe even trucks. "I want to build something real," he once said while looking toward the hills glowing orange at sunset. Joy believed him. And like many young women whose lives had been shaped by struggle, Joy allowed herself to hope. Months passed. Brian began visiting more often. He told Joy he loved her. One night under the quiet sky scattered with stars, he made a promise that would change everything. "Joy," he said softly, holding her hands, "I want you to be my wife." Joy felt her heart race. In a village where most girls married early, the words carried enormous weight. "Are you serious?" she whispered. Brian nodded confidently. "Of course. I just need some time to save money. I want our wedding to be beautiful." Joy believed him completely, and when their relationship deepened, she trusted that promise. For a while, life felt brighter than it ever had. Joy moved through the market with new energy. She hummed quietly while arranging vegetables. Even Mama Nyambura noticed the change. "You look happy these days," her mother said one evening. Joy blushed. "Maybe the future is finally opening for us." Mama Nyambura smiled, but also warned gently. "Hope is good, my daughter, but always protect your heart." Joy nodded, but love has a way of softening caution. Then one morning, Joy woke up with a strange feeling. Her body felt different. Days later, the truth became impossible to ignore. Joy was pregnant. At first, fear and joy collided inside her chest. She waited until evening before telling Brian. They met near the small river where children often washed clothes. Joy's voice trembled as she spoke. "Brian, I'm going to have a baby." For a moment, Brian's face went completely still. The confident smile he always carried disappeared. "You're sure?" he asked. Joy nodded. "I went to the clinic." Silence stretched between them. Joy expected him to pull her into an embrace, to reassure her, to repeat the promises he had made so many times. Instead, Brian stepped back. His eyes shifted away. "This is sudden," he muttered. Joy felt the ground beneath her confidence begin to crack. "But we talked about marriage," she said softly. Brian rubbed the back of his neck. "I know. I just need time to think." Joy watched him carefully. She had never seen him look this uncertain before. Days passed. Brian stopped visiting the market. Joy told herself he was busy. Then a week passed, then two. Finally, Joy went looking for him. She walked to the Boda Boda stage where the motorcycle riders gathered each morning. But Brian's red motorcycle was gone. One rider shrugged when Joy asked about him. "Brian moved to another town," the man said casually. "He said he found better work." Joy felt the air leave her lungs. "Did he leave a message?" she asked. The man shook his head. "No." That was the moment. Joy realized she had been abandoned. Word of her pregnancy spread quickly. Villages have long memories and even faster tongues. At first, people whispered quietly. Then the whispers became open conversations. "Did you hear about Joy? Such a shame. She was a good girl, until now." Women who once greeted her warmly began looking away. Some men laughed behind her back. Customers stopped buying from her stall. Even the church felt colder when she walked through the door. Mama Nyambura tried to stand strong beside her daughter, but the pressure from neighbors grew heavier every day. Joy kept working at the market, even when people stared, even when cruel words followed her footsteps. Inside, however, something fragile had begun to break. Not just her reputation, her sense of belonging. For the first time in her life, Joy Kwamboka felt like a stranger in the very village where she had grown up. And she had no idea that far beyond those quiet hills, a man named Daniel Mwangi, a billionaire whose life seemed worlds away from hers, was already on a journey that would soon change her destiny forever. But for now, Joy only knew one thing. The world she trusted had turned against her, and the hardest days of her life were still ahead. The whispers that followed Joy Kwamboka through the village did not stay whispers for long. In a small place like the hills outside, Kizi silence rarely survives for long. Words move quickly along dirt roads between market stalls, through church pews, and across cooking fires in the evening. Within weeks, nearly everyone knew Joy's story. But what they thought they knew and what was true were very different things. At the Kisi roadside market, where Joy had once been one of the most cheerful vendors, the atmosphere around her stall had changed completely. The same women who used to sit beside her, laughing now, shifted their baskets farther away. Some stopped greeting her at all. Others watched her openly, their eyes lingering on the slow curve of her growing stomach. One morning, a woman named Beatrice Morat, known in the village for her sharp tongue, walked past Joy's stall and stopped deliberately. She looked Joy up and down with obvious disapproval. "So this is where shame now sits in the market," Beatrice said loudly. Several nearby vendors turned to listen. Joy lowered her eyes and continued arranging her tomatoes. "I came here to sell vegetables, Mama Beatrice," she replied quietly. Beatrice clicked her tongue. "Sell vegetables," she scoffed, "or teach young girls how to behave like you." A few women laughed. Joy's hands trembled slightly as she stacked the tomatoes into a neat pile. "I did not ask for trouble," she said softly. But Beatrice was not finished. "You did more than ask for it," the older woman snapped. "You invited it. A girl who respects herself does not end up pregnant with no husband." The laughter spread farther through the market. Joy felt heat rise behind her eyes, but she forced herself not to cry. Instead, she kept working, because vegetables still needed to be sold, and hunger still existed, even when dignity was under attack. But the damage had already begun. Customers who once came to her stall daily now avoided her. Some pretended not to see her. Others walked past with uncomfortable expressions, as if Joy's pregnancy carried some invisible stain. By midday, her basket of vegetables was still nearly full. Across the market, Mama Nyambura sat behind her own small display of cassava. Her face was tight with worry as she watched the scene unfold. She had lived long enough to understand something painful about people. Kindness is admired when life is easy. But when scandal appears, compassion often disappears. That evening, Joy and her mother walked home together along the narrow dirt path that wound between banana trees and small farms. The sun had already begun dipping toward the horizon, painting the hills with soft gold. Mama Nyambura walked slowly, leaning slightly on the wooden stick she used when her joints ached. Joy carried the basket of unsold vegetables. Neither of them spoke for a long time. Finally, Mama Nyambura sighed. "Today was bad again," she asked gently. Joy nodded. "They would not buy," she whispered. Her mother's expression hardened with quiet anger. "People forget too quickly," Mama Nyambura said. "Those same women once came to our door asking for help." Joy stopped walking. "Mama, maybe they are right." Mama Nyambura turned sharply. "Right about what?" Joy swallowed. "Maybe I have shamed you." The older woman's eyes widened with pain. "Do not say that," she said firmly. "But it is true," Joy insisted quietly. "Everywhere I go, people stare at you as well." Mama Nyambura reached out and placed a hand on Joy's shoulder. "My daughter," she said slowly, "listen to me carefully." Joy looked up. "A mistake does not erase who you are," her mother continued. "You are still the girl who helped neighbors when they were sick. You are still the girl who fed hungry children at the market." Joy's voice trembled. "But that is not what they see now." Mama Nyambura's gaze softened. "No," she said sadly. "Right now they only see gossip." They resumed walking. The small house appeared ahead of them through the trees, but peace did not wait there either. Over the following weeks, the cruelty grew bolder. Young men passing on motorcycles sometimes shouted comments as they sped by. "Where is the father?" Joy, one called out mockingly. "Maybe the baby will arrive riding a boda too." Another joked. Laughter followed them down the road. Joy stopped going to church after one Sunday when she overheard two women whispering behind her during the sermon. "She should not even be here," one said. "She is a bad example for our daughters." Joy sat frozen in the wooden pew until the service ended. Then she slipped out quietly, before anyone could speak to her. Even relatives who lived nearby began keeping their distance. An aunt who once visited often now claimed she was too busy whenever Mama Nyambura sent word asking for help. The isolation closed in, like slowly tightening walls. But perhaps the most painful part came from the village elders. In rural communities like theirs, elders carried enormous influence. Their opinions shaped how others behaved. One afternoon, Joy arrived at the market and noticed several elders standing near the center gathering place beneath the large acacia tree. Among them stood Mzee Otieno, the respected senior elder of the village. He was known for his stern views on morality and tradition. Joy tried to avoid drawing attention, but as she passed, she heard his voice. "This situation cannot continue," Mzee Otieno said firmly. Several villagers nodded. "Our daughters are watching," another elder added. "We cannot allow this behavior to spread." Joy's stomach tightened. Mzee Otieno continued speaking. "A child without a father brings questions to the entire community." Joy lowered her head and walked faster, but the words followed her. Even when she reached her stall, she could still feel the weight of those judgments pressing down on her chest. That night, as rain began tapping softly on the iron roof of their house, Joy lay awake on her thin mattress. Mama Nyambura had already fallen asleep in the next room, her breathing slow and uneven. Joy placed a hand gently on her stomach. The baby inside her moved slightly. For a moment, a strange calm filled her heart. This child had done nothing wrong. Yet somehow the entire village had decided that both mother and baby carried shame. Joy stared at the dark ceiling. A quiet question formed in her mind. Was there any place left in the world where she belonged? What she did not know was that hundreds of kilometers away in the bright lights of Nairobi, a man named Daniel Mwangi, a billionaire whose life had been shaped by power loss and disappointment, was preparing to leave the city for a journey that would soon bring him directly into the path of Joy Kwamboka. And when that moment arrived, the same village that now rejected her would witness something they never expected. But for now, Joy's world remained small, lonely, and heavy with judgment. And the storm, gathering around her life, was only beginning. For many people in the village, Joy Kwamboka's pregnancy had already become a story they believed they understood. But the truth behind it, the quiet hopes, the promises whispered under the stars, the trust that had once filled her heart, remained unseen. Long before the gossip, before the cruel laughter at the market, there had been a different season in Joy's life, a season filled with warmth and with Brian Uma. Brian had arrived in the village almost a year earlier, riding his bright red boda boda, with the easy confidence of someone who knew how to make an impression. The first time Joy noticed him, he was laughing loudly with a group of passengers near the roadside stage. Dust rose behind the motorcycle as he pulled away, leaving a trail of excitement that seemed out of place in the quiet farming community. At first, Joy barely paid attention. Her days were too full. Every morning before sunrise, she woke to help Mama Nyambura prepare vegetables for the market. After that, she carried baskets along the narrow road, arranged her stall, greeted customers, and worked until the afternoon sun turned the air heavy and slow. Brian's world was different. He spent his days moving between villages, carrying passengers' goods and stories from one place to another. And somehow again and again his route seemed to bring him past Joy's stall. At first it was only small exchanges, a greeting, a joke about the heat, a quick purchase of roasted maize before rushing off again. But Brian had a way of making people feel noticed. One afternoon he leaned casually against his motorcycle while Joy wrapped maize in newspaper for him. "You always work too hard," he said. Joy smiled slightly. "And you always talk too much." Brian laughed. "That is why people like riding with me." Joy handed him the maize. "Or maybe they have no other driver." Brian placed a hand over his heart dramatically. "Ah, Joy, you wound me." She laughed despite herself. From that day forward, Brian began stopping at her stall, almost every afternoon. Sometimes he brought stories from nearby towns about busy markets, new shops, or strange passengers who argued over fares. Other days he simply sat nearby, while Joy finished selling her vegetables. Slowly, the small conversations turned into something deeper. Brian started walking Joy home after the market closed. The dusty path to her house passed through banana trees and small farms, and during those walks the world seemed quieter. They talked about everything, about Joy's childhood, about Brian's dream of owning more motorcycles, about building a better future, beyond the narrow limits of the village. Mama Nyambura noticed the change immediately. When Brian first arrived at their house carrying a bag of sugar as a gift, she watched him carefully. He greeted her respectfully. "Good evening, Mama," he said with a polite bow of his head. Mama Nyambura studied him for a moment. "You ride the boda in the market," she said. "Yes. And you spend a lot of time talking to my daughter." Brian did not deny it. "She is someone worth talking to." The older woman's expression softened slightly. "Words are easy," she replied. "Character takes time." Brian nodded seriously. "I understand." Over the following months, Brian visited often. He helped repair a broken fence behind the house. He carried heavy water containers when Mama Nyambura's joints were hurting. He even joined them for supper on several evenings, laughing easily as they shared simple meals of ugali and vegetables. Joy's heart slowly opened. For the first time since her father's death, she allowed herself to imagine a future that held something brighter than survival. One night the three of them sat outside under a sky thick with stars. The air was cool and the sound of crickets filled the darkness. Brian spoke about his plans. "I don't want to ride bodas forever," he said. Joy looked at him curiously. "What do you want instead?" Brian leaned back and pointed toward the distant hills. "Transport business. Maybe 5 motorcycles first, then more." Mama Nyambura listened quietly. "Dreams are good," she said. Brian nodded. "But I also want a family." His eyes moved toward Joy. She felt her heart begin to beat faster. Later that night, after Mama Nyambura had gone inside, Brian walked Joy a short distance down the path. The moonlight shimmered faintly across the banana leaves. Brian stopped walking. "Joy," he said softly. She turned to him. "Yes." He reached for her hands. "I want to marry you." The words hung in the air like something fragile and glowing. Joy's breath caught. "Are you serious?" she whispered. Brian nodded. "Completely serious." "But," how she asked nervously, "your business is still small." Brian smiled confidently. "That is why I need time." "How much time?" "A year," he said. "Maybe less." Joy studied his face. He looked certain. Hope rose inside her chest like sunlight after rain. "I would like that," she admitted quietly. From that night forward, Joy's life felt different. She woke each morning with energy. She hummed songs while preparing vegetables. She even began saving small coins in a jar, imagining the wedding day Brian had promised. Mama Nyambura watched with cautious optimism. One evening, she spoke privately to Joy. "My daughter," she said gently, "love is beautiful. But never forget that promises must be proven." Joy nodded. "I know," but she believed Brian. She believed him completely. Then everything changed. Several months later, Joy noticed something unusual about her body. At first she ignored it, but when the signs became clear, she traveled quietly to the small health clinic in the neighboring town. The nurse confirmed what Joy already suspected. "You are pregnant," the nurse said kindly. Joy walked home slowly that day. Her heart was racing, with a mixture of fear and excitement. A baby. Brian would surely be surprised, but he would also be happy. After all, he had already spoken of marriage and family. That evening, Joy met him near the small river outside the village. The water moved slowly over smooth stones. Brian arrived late, removing his helmet as he approached. "You look serious," he said lightly. Joy took a breath. "Brian, I went to the clinic today." "Oh," he replied. "They said, I am going to have a baby." For a moment, Brian did not move. The easy confidence Joy had always seen in him vanished. "You're sure?" he asked quietly. "Yes." Brian looked away toward the river. The silence stretched uncomfortably. Joy's chest tightened. "A baby means we should start preparing for the wedding sooner," she said carefully. Brian did not answer immediately. Instead, he rubbed his forehead. "This is unexpected." Joy felt a cold ripple move through her stomach. "But you promised we would marry." Brian shifted his weight. "I know. Then what is the problem?" He sighed heavily. "I just need time to think." Joy's heart began to sink. "But the baby, I said I need time." Brian interrupted. The sharpness in his voice startled her. Joy stood there silently as Brian picked up his helmet. "I'll come see you soon," he muttered before walking away. But he did not come. Days passed, then a week, then another. Brian stopped visiting the market. Joy tried calling him through a neighbor's phone, but the number no longer connected. Finally, she walked to the Bota stage where the drivers gathered. Brian's red motorcycle was gone. "Where is he?" Joy asked one of the riders. The man shrugged. "He left. Left where? Another town." "Better work," he said. Joy felt the world tilt slightly beneath her feet. "Did he say anything for me?" The rider shook his head. "No." Joy walked home slowly that afternoon. The sky above the hills looked painfully wide and empty. With every step, the truth became clearer. Brian Uma had disappeared, and he had taken his promises with him. Now Joy Kwamboka stood alone with a child growing inside her and a village that would soon begin asking questions she could not answer, while Joy Kwamboka's world was shrinking beneath the weight of gossip and shame. Another life far removed from dusty village roads and open-air markets was moving in a completely different direction. Hundreds of kilometers away in the restless heart of Nairobi, Daniel Mwangi stood at the top floor of a glass tower overlooking the city. From his office window, the skyline stretched endlessly, steel buildings reflecting the afternoon sun traffic, crawling through busy streets and the distant hum of a city that never seemed to rest. Daniel had built much of that world. At 36 years old, he was one of the most powerful businessmen in East Africa. His company, Mwangi Global Logistics, operated fleets of cargo trucks across Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania. He had invested in technology startups, transportation networks, and even renewable energy projects in rural areas. Magazines often called him the quiet billionaire. He rarely attended parties. He almost never appeared in gossip columns. And despite his wealth, Daniel lived a surprisingly private life. But the silence around him did not mean peace. Standing near the wide office window that afternoon, Daniel looked down at the crowded streets far below and felt something he had been feeling more and more lately. Exhaustion, not the kind caused by work, but the kind created by disappointment. His assistant, Grace Najeri, knocked lightly on the door. "Sir," she said carefully. Daniel turned. "Yes, the board members have arrived for the meeting." Daniel nodded. "I'll be there in a minute." Grace hesitated. "There's also a call from the Nairobi Business Network. They want to confirm your attendance at tomorrow's investors' dinner." Daniel sighed quietly. "You can decline." Grace blinked slightly. Again. "Yes." She nodded and left the room. Daniel leaned back against his desk. Events like that had once interested him. Networking dinners, business celebrations, award ceremonies. But over time, they had begun to feel strangely empty. Too many conversations ended the same way. People smiled warmly when they believed Daniel could benefit them. Women approached him with charm that faded the moment they realized he valued sincerity more than appearance. Even friendships sometimes carried hidden expectations. It had become difficult to know who truly cared and who only saw opportunity. Daniel's thoughts drifted to someone who had never treated him that way. His mother, Mama Wanjiku Mwangi, had passed away 6 months earlier. Her death had left a quiet absence that money could not fill. She had been a simple woman despite her son's wealth. She still preferred traditional markets over luxury stores, still cooked meals with her own hands when Daniel visited, still reminded him of where he came from. "You can build towers," she once told him gently, "but never forget the soil your feet first touched." Daniel missed her voice. More than that, he missed the sense of clarity she brought into his complicated world. Since her death, he had begun asking himself questions he had ignored for years. Why did success feel so hollow sometimes? Why did every achievement seem to lead to another expectation instead of peace? And most importantly, where had he lost the simple sense of purpose that once drove him? The answer he suspected was distance. Distance from ordinary life. Distance from the people whose struggles had once shaped his ambitions. Distance from the rural roots his mother had always cherished. Daniel walked to a small framed photograph on his desk. It showed a much younger version of himself standing beside Mama Wanjiku in front of a modest home surrounded by green hills. That house had been in a small village near Nyamira, not far from the Kisii region. It was where Daniel had spent many childhood holidays before. His father moved the family permanently to Nairobi. Mama Wanjiku had loved that village deeply, even after Daniel's company became successful. She often spoke about returning there. "Cities make people forget how to breathe," she would say with a smile. Daniel picked up the photograph. He remembered the smell of fresh rain on red soil, the sound of goats moving through tall grass, the quiet rhythm of life that did not depend on deadlines or contracts. Maybe that was what he needed now. Not another meeting, not another business deal, but distance, space to think. That evening, Daniel made a decision that surprised even his closest staff. The next morning, Grace Njeri found a simple instruction waiting on her desk. Cancel all meetings for the next week. Urgent matters to be handled by the executive team. Destination, Nyamira region. When Grace called Daniel to confirm, she sounded puzzled. "You're traveling alone?" she asked. "Yes. No security convoy, just one driver." Grace paused. "Sir, the press will ask questions." Daniel smiled faintly. "Let them ask." And so early the next morning, a dark SUV left the bustling streets of Nairobi and began moving westward toward the green hills of western Kenya. Daniel sat quietly in the back seat, watching the landscape change through the window. The concrete towers of the city slowly gave way to open fields. Traffic noise faded into the distant hum of wind moving through farmland. Villages appeared along the road, small shops with tin roofs, children walking in school uniforms, farmers carrying sacks of produce. Daniel felt something inside him begin to settle. After several hours, the driver glanced into the rearview mirror. "Sir, we are approaching the Nyamira area." Daniel nodded. "Good." They stopped briefly in a small town so Daniel could stretch his legs. Unlike in Nairobi, no one here recognized him. To the people passing by, he looked like just another traveler. For the first time in months, Daniel felt strangely free. Back on the road, he instructed the driver to take a smaller route that wound through villages and farmland. "I want to see the countryside," he said. The SUV rolled slowly along the narrow road. Women walked beside the path carrying baskets of vegetables on their heads. Children waved at the passing vehicle. Goats wandered lazily across the dusty ground. The quiet beauty of the region reminded Daniel strongly of his mother. Somewhere ahead, hidden among these hills and farms, life was unfolding in ways completely separate from boardrooms and billion-dollar contracts. Daniel did not know it yet. But one of those lives belonged to a young woman named Joy Kwamboka. At that exact moment, Joy was standing alone in the market trying once again to sell vegetables to customers who refused to look her in the eye. And within a matter of days, the paths of the billionaire and the shamed village girl would cross. When that happened, neither of them would remain the same. For Daniel Mwangi, the journey he believed was about rediscovering his roots would turn into something far more unexpected. And for Joy Kwamboka, whose world had been shrinking under the weight of judgment, that same journey would open a door she never imagined possible. But for now, the two of them remained strangers moving slowly toward a meeting that destiny seemed determined to arrange. By the time Daniel Mwangi's vehicle entered the rolling hills near the Kisii region, the afternoon sky had begun to change. Dark clouds gathered slowly over the distant ridges, spreading like a quiet warning across the horizon. The driver glanced upward through the windshield. "Looks like rain is coming, sir." Daniel followed his gaze. In western Kenya, storms could arrive quickly. One moment the air warm and calm, the next filled with rushing wind and heavy drops of rain, pounding the red earth. "That's fine," Daniel said calmly. "We'll keep going." The SUV continued along the narrow road that curved between small farms and scattered houses. Children ran alongside the vehicle, briefly laughing and waving. Goats scattered lazily from the road as the car approached. Daniel watched everything with quiet attention. The farther they moved from the city, the more the world seemed to slow down. People here lived differently, not rushed, not surrounded by constant noise, just steady life unfolding one day at a time. And yet, even in that peaceful landscape, not everything was as calm as it appeared. Several kilometers ahead in the village market, Joy Kwamboka was experiencing one of the hardest afternoons of her life. The sky had already begun darkening when she arrived at the market that day. A strong wind swept dust across the open square, rattling the metal roofs of nearby stalls. Most vendors hurried to secure their goods before the rain came. Joy worked quietly beside her small wooden table, stacking tomatoes and green vegetables into neat rows. But she could feel the same heavy atmosphere that had followed her for weeks. People watched, whispered, avoided her stall. A group of women gathered under the shelter across from her. Joy heard her name spoken several times between the rising gusts of wind. Then, as if the storm in the sky had awakened something in the people as well, the whispers became louder. Beatrice Mora appeared again, walking slowly through the market, with her arms crossed. She stopped near Joy's table. "So," Beatrice said loudly, glancing at Joy's stomach, still pretending nothing happened. Joy kept arranging vegetables. "I came to sell food, Mama Beatrice." "Sell food," Beatrice repeated mockingly. Several women nearby chuckled. "Who would buy from someone like you?" Joy did not answer. Her silence only seemed to irritate Beatrice more. "You should be ashamed to stand here," the older woman continued. "A child without a father. And you still act like nothing is wrong." The wind grew stronger. A few drops of rain began tapping against the metal roofs. Joy finally looked up. "I have done nothing to you," she said quietly. Beatrice laughed sharply. "You have done something to the entire village." More villagers had begun gathering now, drawn by the argument and the approaching rain. A young man pointed toward Joy. "Maybe she does not even know who the father is." The crowd erupted with cruel laughter. Joy felt her chest tighten. She had grown used to whispers, but open humiliation was harder to endure. Before she could respond, a sudden flash of lightning lit the darkening sky. Thunder followed almost immediately. The first heavy drops of rain began falling. Most vendors rushed toward nearby shelters. Joy hesitated. Her stall stood in the open area of the market. She grabbed her basket, trying to protect the vegetables. But before she could move far, the rain intensified, thick sheets of water pouring down across the square. Joy ran toward the closest shelter, but as she reached the covered area, Beatrice stepped forward and blocked the entrance. "No," she said coldly. Joy froze. "I just need to wait until the rain slows," Joy said. Beatrice shook her head. "You bring shame with you." A few other women standing nearby shifted uncomfortably, but none stepped aside. Joy felt the rain soaking through her clothes. Water dripped from her hair. Her stomach felt heavy beneath the wet fabric. "Please," she whispered. But Beatrice turned her back. "You should have thought about that before." Joy stepped back slowly. The rain poured harder. Thunder rolled across the hills. For a moment, she simply stood there in the middle of the market, drenched and trembling. Then something unexpected happened. Near the edge of the market, an elderly woman named Shosho slipped in the mud while trying to carry a heavy sack of maize. The old woman fell hard, crying out in pain. The crowd gasped, but no one moved immediately. The rain made the ground slippery and dangerous. Without thinking, Joy ran forward. Despite the water pouring down her face, she knelt beside the elderly woman. "Shosho, are you hurt?" "My leg," the old woman groaned. Joy carefully helped lift the sack away and supported the woman's shoulders. "Slowly," Joy said gently. She ignored the rain, the mud, and the villagers staring around her. Her focus remained only on helping the struggling woman stand. After a few moments, Shosho managed to steady herself. "Thank you, my child," the old woman whispered gratefully. Joy nodded softly. "It's nothing," but someone else had witnessed the moment. At the far end of the road leading into the village, Daniel Mwangi's SUV had slowed as the rain intensified. The driver squinted through the windshield. "The market ahead looks crowded, sir." Daniel leaned slightly forward. Through the blurred curtain of rain, he could see figures moving hurriedly. But one scene stood out. A young woman soaked completely by the storm, kneeling in the mud to help an elderly stranger. Even from a distance, something about the moment felt striking. "Stop the car," Daniel said quietly. The driver hesitated. "Here, sir, yes." The SUV rolled slowly to the side of the road. Daniel stepped out into the rain. Cold water hit his shoulders instantly, but he barely noticed. His eyes remained fixed on the young woman in the market. She was clearly pregnant. Her clothes clung to her body, soaked through by the storm. And yet she had been the only one who moved to help the fallen elderly woman. Daniel watched as she carefully guided the old woman toward a small shop doorway where someone finally offered shelter. Then the young woman stepped back into the rain again, alone. The villagers continued watching her from the covered areas, but none invited her inside. Daniel felt something tighten in his chest. "Sir," the driver called from the car, "should we continue?" Daniel did not answer immediately. Instead, he kept watching the woman standing alone beneath the rain. Her shoulders were slightly bent, but there was something unbroken about her posture. A quiet strength. Daniel did not yet know her name. He did not know the story behind the cold stares surrounding her. But one thing was already clear. The woman standing in that storm was different from everyone else around her, and for reasons Daniel could not yet explain, he suddenly knew he wanted to understand why. The rain continued falling heavily over the village market, turning the red earth into slippery mud. Water flowed in small streams along the uneven ground, while the metal roofs of nearby stalls rattled loudly under the downpour. Most villagers had already crowded beneath the available shelters, pressing close together to avoid the storm. But Joy Kwamboka remained outside. Her dress clung to her body, soaked through, from head to toe. Strands of wet hair stuck to her face, and the chill of the rain made her shoulders tremble slightly. Still, she did not move toward the shelter again. She had already been told clearly she was not welcome there. Instead, she stood beside her small table, trying to protect the remaining vegetables from being washed away. Across the market, the villagers watched, some with curiosity, others with quiet satisfaction. Beatrice Marries folded her arms and shook her head. "Let her stand there," she muttered to the women beside her. "Maybe the rain will wash away her shame." A few people laughed softly, but none stepped forward to help. Near the edge of the market road, Daniel Mwangi remained standing beside his SUV, watching the scene unfold. Rain soaked his jacket and darkened the road beneath his shoes. His driver leaned slightly out of the vehicle window. "Sir, you'll get sick standing out here." Daniel barely heard him. His attention remained fixed on the woman across the square. The pregnant woman. There was something unusual about the way she carried herself. Even while soaked by rain and surrounded by silent judgment, she did not appear defeated. Hurt, yes, but not broken. Daniel turned to his driver. "What village is this?" The driver shrugged slightly. "A small community near Kisii, sir. I don't know the exact name." Daniel nodded slowly. Then he made a quiet decision. "I'll be back in a moment." Before the driver could protest, Daniel stepped away from the vehicle and began walking toward the market. The rain had softened slightly, but the ground was still slick with mud. Villagers noticed him immediately. A stranger walking calmly through the storm toward the center of their gathering was not something they expected. Several people exchanged curious glances. "Who is that one man?" whispered. "I don't know," another replied. Daniel ignored the whispers. His steps were steady and unhurried. As he approached the vegetable stall, Joy noticed him for the first time. At first, she assumed he was just another traveler caught in the storm. But as he came closer, something about his presence felt different. He did not stare at her stomach the way others did. He did not glance at her with judgment. Instead, his eyes held calm curiosity. Joy instinctively straightened slightly. The stranger stopped beside her stall. "You should be under shelter," he said quietly. His voice was calm and respectful. Joy blinked in surprise. "I tried," she replied softly. Daniel glanced toward the covered area where several villagers stood watching. He understood immediately. They would not allow it. Joy did not answer. She simply lowered her gaze. Daniel studied the vegetables on the table, wet tomatoes, spinach, and green peppers, slowly collecting drops of rain. "You might lose all of these in the storm," he said. "That happens sometimes," Joy replied quietly. Daniel hesitated for a moment. Then he did something simple. He picked up one of the tomatoes. How much? Joy looked up again, confused. "For the tomatoes?" she asked. "Yes." She shook her head slightly. "You don't have to buy anything. I want to." Joy paused. 20 shillings, she said. Daniel reached into his pocket and handed her a small note. Joy glanced down at it. It was far more than the vegetables were worth. "You gave too much," she said. "That's fine." Joy frowned slightly. "I cannot accept that." Daniel smiled faintly. "Then give me more vegetables." For the first time that day, a small, uncertain smile touched Joy's face. She placed several tomatoes and peppers into a small plastic bag and handed it to him. "Thank you," she said politely. Daniel nodded. "You're welcome." They stood in silence for a moment while the rain softened to a gentle drizzle. Behind them, the villagers continued watching. Beatrice Marries whispered sharply to the women beside her. "Look at her now, already entertaining another man." One of the younger women frowned. "He only bought vegetables," Beatrice snorted. "That is how it starts." Back at the stall, Daniel glanced toward the villagers again. "They seem very interested in you," he said quietly. Joy's expression tightened slightly. "That happens often these days." Daniel studied her for a moment. "If you don't mind me asking." Why Joy hesitated. For a second she considered ignoring the question. But something about the stranger's calm tone made it difficult to remain silent. "Because I am pregnant," she said simply. Daniel nodded slowly. "And that makes you unwelcome." Joy gave a faint, bitter smile. "Not everywhere." She looked briefly toward the villagers watching them. "But here, yes." Daniel followed her gaze. He noticed the disapproval in their expressions, the subtle distance they maintained from her, and the uncomfortable truth became obvious. "They are judging you," he said quietly. Joy did not respond immediately. Then she sighed softly. "It is easier for people to judge than to understand." Daniel felt a quiet respect growing inside him. Most people in her situation would be defensive or angry. But Joy spoke with calm dignity. "What is your name?" he asked. She hesitated. "Joy," she said. "Joy Kwamboka." Daniel nodded. "Daniel." She looked at him curiously. "You're not from here?" "No, just passing through, for now." The rain finally stopped. Sunlight began breaking through the clouds, reflecting off the wet ground. The villagers slowly returned to their activities, though many still glanced toward Joy and the stranger beside her. Daniel placed the bag of vegetables inside his jacket pocket. "I should go," he said. Joy nodded politely. "Thank you for buying something." Daniel turned to leave. Then he paused. "If you don't mind me saying," he added quietly, "you handled that situation with great patience." Joy blinked slightly. "Which situation?" "The storm," he replied. "And the people." Joy looked toward the muddy ground. "You learn patience when life gives you no other choice." Daniel studied her one last time. The strength in her voice confirmed what he had sensed earlier. This woman carried more than just the weight of a child. She carried dignity in the face of humiliation. That was rare. "Take care, Joy Kwamboka," Daniel said. "You, too," she replied. Daniel walked back toward the waiting SUV. The villagers watched him go with growing curiosity. Joy returned to rearranging the vegetables on her table. But for the first time in many days, the heaviness pressing on her heart felt slightly lighter, because someone, just one stranger passing through, had looked at her without judgment. What neither of them knew was that this brief conversation in the rain was only the beginning. Their paths would cross again. And when they did, the quiet meeting beside a muddy vegetable stall would become the first step in a story that would shake the entire village. After the rain stopped, the village market slowly returned to its usual rhythm. Sunlight pushed through the heavy clouds, warming the wet red soil and turning the puddles into small mirrors reflecting the sky. Vendors rearranged their goods, customers returned cautiously, and the sounds of bargaining once again filled the air. But for Joy Kwamboka, something inside her felt different. The brief encounter with the stranger, named Daniel, lingered quietly in her thoughts. Not because of what he said, but because of what he did not say. He had not asked her accusing questions. He had not stared at her stomach with curiosity or judgment. He had not whispered behind her back like the others. Instead, he had simply spoken to her like a normal person. In recent weeks, that simple kindness had become something rare. Joy finished selling a few vegetables before packing the remaining ones into her basket. The market was calmer now, but she still felt the familiar eyes watching her. When she began walking home along the dirt road, she could hear faint murmurs behind her. She's walking proudly now. Maybe the stranger promised her something. Men like that don't stop in villages for nothing. Joy pretended not to hear. She had learned that responding to rumors only gave them more life. Still, as she walked past the last cluster of market stalls, she found herself glancing once toward the road where the dark SUV had been parked earlier. The vehicle was gone. For reasons she could not explain, she felt a strange sense of disappointment. Meanwhile, several kilometers away, Daniel Mwangi was sitting inside the moving SUV as it continued along the winding rural road. The bag of vegetables Joy had given him rested on the seat beside him. His driver glanced into the mirror. "Sir, are we continuing to Nyamira town?" Daniel leaned slightly back in his seat. Yes. But his mind was not on the road ahead. Instead, it kept returning to the image of the pregnant woman standing alone in the rain. He had seen many forms of hardship during his life. When he was younger, before his company grew successful, he had visited countless rural communities while helping his father's small transport business. He had seen poverty. He had seen injustice. But something about the situation in that village market had felt different. It was not just poverty. It was isolation, the way the villagers had looked at her, the way she had been denied shelter, the quiet cruelty of collective judgment. Daniel rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "What did you notice back there?" he asked suddenly. The driver looked confused. "Sir, at the market." The driver hesitated before answering. "That girl, yes? Well, people didn't seem to like her." Daniel nodded. "Why do you think that is?" The driver shrugged. "In villages, things spread quickly. If someone does something the community doesn't approve of, they become an example. An example. For others," the driver explained. Daniel stared out the window. He had heard similar explanations many times. Communities protecting tradition, moral lessons, social order. But today the reasoning felt hollow, because the woman he had seen helping the elderly stranger in the rain did not look like someone who deserved that treatment. "Strange," Daniel murmured. "What is, sir? That kindness can sometimes be invisible, while mistakes become permanent." The driver did not respond. The road ahead curved through green hills and scattered farms. After a few minutes, Daniel spoke again. "Turn around." The driver blinked in surprise. "Sir, go back. To the market, yes." The driver hesitated only briefly before steering the SUV into a slow turn. Back in the village, Joy had already reached home. Their small house stood quietly at the edge of a field, where tall grass swayed gently in the wind after the rain. Smoke rose from a nearby cooking fire. Mama Nyambura was sitting on a wooden stool, outside sorting beans into a metal bowl. When she saw Joy approaching, she frowned slightly. "You are wet." Joy set the basket down. The rain started suddenly. Mama Nyambura studied her daughter carefully, but something about Joy's expression seemed lighter than usual. "You look different today," the older woman said. Joy wiped her face with a cloth. "Do I?" "Yes. Maybe the rain washed away some sadness." Mama Nyambura smiled faintly at the attempt at humor. "What happened at the market?" Joy hesitated. Then she spoke. "A stranger came." Mama Nyambura raised an eyebrow. "A stranger. He bought vegetables. That is normal." Joy nodded slowly. "Yes, but he spoke to me like nothing was wrong." Mama Nyambura's expression softened slightly. "That must have felt good." Joy sat down beside her. For a moment it did. "What was his name? Daniel?" Mama Nyambura nodded thoughtfully. "Sometimes God sends small kindnesses when we need them most." Joy looked down at her hands. "I don't think I'll see him again." At that exact moment, a dark SUV rolled slowly into the village road again. Inside the vehicle, Daniel was looking carefully at the surrounding houses. "Where did the girl go?" he asked. The driver scanned the area. "Most likely home." Daniel nodded. We'll drive through the village. As the vehicle moved along the narrow dirt road, several villagers turned to watch. Luxury cars rarely appeared in their quiet community. Children ran alongside briefly, before stopping in curiosity. Then the SUV slowed near the small house at the edge of the field. Daniel noticed Joy immediately. She was sitting beside an older woman speaking quietly while sorting vegetables. The peaceful image felt completely different from the lonely figure he had seen standing in the rain. The driver lowered his voice. That must be her. Daniel watched for a moment. Joy laughed softly at something her mother said. The sound was faint but genuine. For a brief second, Daniel felt something unexpected. Relief. Because despite everything she had endured, the woman named Joy Kwamboka still had the ability to smile. Daniel leaned back in his seat. "Keep driving," he said quietly. "Sir, just pass through." The SUV rolled slowly past the house. Joy looked up briefly as the vehicle passed. For a split second, her eyes met Daniel's through the window. Neither of them spoke, but both recognized each other instantly. Then the car continued down the road and disappeared around the curve. Joy stared after it for a moment. Mama Nyambura noticed. "Who is that?" Joy shook her head slowly. "I don't know." But somewhere deep inside her heart, she had the strange feeling that the stranger named Daniel had not simply passed through her life by accident. And as the sun lowered over the quiet hills, a new chapter of their story had already begun, one that neither of them yet understood. The following morning, the village woke beneath a soft gray sky. The rain from the previous day had left the ground damp and cool. Small puddles still clung to the edges of the narrow dirt paths, and the air smelled fresh with wet soil and crushed grass. But in the small house at the edge of the field, Joy Kwamboka woke with a heavy feeling in her chest. The brief moment of kindness she had experienced the previous afternoon had not erased the reality waiting outside her door. Villages have long memories, and rumors travel faster than the wind. As Joy stepped outside that morning carrying a small basin of water to wash, she noticed two women walking slowly along the road nearby. They lowered their voices when they saw her looking. Joy pretended not to notice. She had grown used to this quiet surveillance. Inside the house, Mama Nyambura was already preparing tea over the charcoal stove. "You should eat before going to the market," her mother said. Joy nodded and sat beside the small wooden table. But her appetite had been fading lately. Mama Nyambura watched her daughter carefully. "You are thinking too much again," she said gently. Joy forced a small smile. "That seems to be my new habit," her mother sighed. "People's words are heavy stones if you carry them." Joy stirred her tea slowly. "I try not to carry them," she said quietly. "But they keep throwing more." Mama Nyambura did not answer immediately. Instead, she reached across the table and placed her hand over Joy's. "You are not alone," she said softly. Joy squeezed her mother's fingers. For a moment, the warmth of that reassurance helped. But once Joy arrived at the market, the familiar atmosphere returned immediately. Conversation stopped when she approached. Several vendors glanced toward her and then looked away. The quiet tension in the air felt almost physical. Joy arranged her vegetables as usual and waited. Customers passed by. Some slowed, but most continued walking. By mid-morning, she had sold almost nothing. Across the market, a group of elders had gathered beneath the large acacia tree once again. Among them stood Mzee Otieno, his tall wooden staff resting against his shoulder. He spoke quietly, with two other elders, while several villagers listened nearby. Joy tried not to pay attention, but eventually she noticed something unsettling. Several of them were glancing in her direction. After a few minutes, a young man approached her stall. "Joy," he said awkwardly. "Yes, the elders want to speak with you." Joy's stomach tightened immediately. "When today?" Her voice dropped slightly. About what? The young man hesitated. You know why. Joy closed her eyes briefly. She did know. The rumors, the pregnancy, the constant whispers about shame and responsibility. It was only a matter of time before the village leaders decided to address it formally. When she asked again, "This afternoon," Joy nodded slowly. "Thank you for telling me." The young man shifted uncomfortably before walking away. Joy remained still for several seconds. Then she resumed arranging her vegetables, even though her hands had begun trembling slightly. Across the market, Beatrice Morat had clearly overheard the conversation. She leaned toward the women beside her with obvious satisfaction. Finally, Beatrice said, "It was only a matter of time." Joy kept her eyes on the table, but she could feel the weight of anticipation spreading through the market. People loved spectacle, and the village elders, questioning the most talked-about woman in the community, promised exactly that. Meanwhile, several kilometers away, Daniel Mwangi had stopped for breakfast at a small roadside cafe near the main road. The cafe was simple wooden tables, metal chairs, and the comforting smell of frying mandazi drifting through the air. Daniel sat quietly near the window while the waitress poured him tea. Most customers paid little attention to him. Here he was just another traveler. But his thoughts were far from relaxed. The image of Joy Kwamboka, standing in the rain, continued returning to his mind. He found himself wondering questions he had no right to ask. Why was the village treating her that way? What had truly happened, and why did he feel strangely unsettled by it? Daniel took a slow sip of tea. Normally, he avoided involving himself in local disputes. Communities had their own traditions and systems. But something about the situation felt deeply unfair. His phone vibrated softly on the table. It was Grace and Jerry calling from Nairobi. Daniel answered. "Good morning, Grace." "Good morning, sir. I hope your trip is going well." "It is. There is a meeting the board wants to schedule for next week." Daniel glanced out the window toward the distant hills. "We can discuss that later." Grace hesitated. "Sir, is everything all right?" Daniel smiled faintly. "Yes. I'm just thinking about business." Grace sounded surprised. Then about what Daniel paused. "About people." Grace laughed lightly. "That sounds serious." "It might be." He ended the call and returned his phone to his pocket. After finishing breakfast, Daniel stood and stepped outside the cafe. The road stretched quietly ahead. Somewhere beyond the hills was the same village where Joy lived, the same place where he had witnessed something troubling the previous day. Daniel hesitated for only a moment before speaking to his driver. "We're going back. To the village, sir, yes." The driver nodded and started the engine. Back at the market, the hours passed slowly. Joy sold a few vegetables but remained distracted. By midday, several villagers had already begun gathering beneath the large acacia tree. Word had spread quickly. The elders were going to address Joy's situation publicly, and nearly everyone wanted to witness it. Joy finally packed her remaining vegetables into the basket. Her heart felt heavy, but she knew avoiding the meeting would only make things worse. So she walked slowly toward the tree. The crowd parted slightly as she approached. Some faces showed curiosity. Others held open judgment. Mzee Otieno stood in the center of the gathering. When he saw Joy arrive, he raised his staff slightly. "Joy Kwamboka," he said firmly. Joy stopped a few steps away. "Yes, Mzee." The elder studied her carefully. "You know why we have called you here." Joy nodded slowly. "Yes." Mzee Otieno looked around at the villagers gathered nearby. "Our community has traditions," he said loudly. "Traditions that protect the dignity of our families." Joy felt every pair of eyes in the crowd fixed on her. And just as the elder prepared to continue speaking, a distant sound interrupted the moment. The low rumble of an approaching engine. Several villagers turned their heads toward the road. Within seconds, a dark SUV appeared at the entrance to the village, and inside that vehicle sat Daniel Mwangi, returning for reasons he himself was only beginning to understand. The confrontation about to unfold beneath the acacia tree would soon become far more complicated than the elders expected. The rumble of the approaching vehicle drew every eye in the village square toward the dusty road. Conversation stopped. Even Mzee Otieno paused mid-sentence, his hand still resting on the tall wooden staff he used to command attention. The dark SUV rolled slowly toward the gathering beneath the acacia tree, its polished body reflecting the bright afternoon sun. Luxury vehicles were rare in this quiet farming community. When one appeared, it immediately became the center of curiosity. Children ran closer to the road. Men shaded their eyes with their hands. Women whispered to one another. Who could that be? Maybe a government official. No. Those cars belonged to rich people from the city. Near the center of the crowd, Joy Kwamboka stood frozen. Her heart was already beating fast because of the elders' meeting. Now the sudden arrival of the unfamiliar vehicle only deepened the tension. Joy tried to ignore it. This gathering was about her, about the pregnancy, about the shame the village believed she had brought upon them. Whatever business the stranger had here likely had nothing to do with her. But as the SUV came closer, something about the figure visible through the windshield felt strangely familiar. Joy's breath caught slightly. When the vehicle stopped near the edge of the square and the door opened, the man who stepped out was unmistakable. Daniel, the same calm stranger who had bought vegetables from her stall the previous day. Joy blinked in surprise. Across the gathering, whispers erupted immediately. "Who is that man? He's not from here. Why would someone like that come to our village?" Daniel closed the car door and glanced around the square. His eyes moved calmly across the faces of the villagers until they landed on Joy. For a brief moment, recognition passed silently between them. Then Daniel walked forward. The villagers instinctively stepped aside, creating a path without anyone needing to say a word. There was something about his quiet confidence that commanded space. When he reached the edge of the crowd, he stopped respectfully a few steps away from the elders. "Good afternoon," Daniel said calmly. Mzee Otieno studied him carefully. "Good afternoon," the elder replied. "You are a visitor." "Yes. What brings you here?" Daniel glanced briefly at the gathered villagers. "I was passing through the area," he said. "I noticed there was a meeting." Mzee Otieno nodded slowly. "This is a community matter. I understand." Daniel's tone remained respectful. I did not intend to interrupt. The elder seemed satisfied with the explanation. He turned back toward Joy. "As I was saying," Mzee Otieno continued, loudly addressing the crowd again, "our community cannot ignore actions that bring dishonor to our traditions." Joy felt every gaze return to her. Her throat tightened. She knew exactly what was coming. "Joy Kwamboka," the elder said firmly, "you stand before us carrying a child without a husband." A ripple of murmurs passed through the crowd. Joy kept her eyes lowered. "You have refused to name the father," Mzee Otieno continued. Joy swallowed. "I have told you the truth," she said quietly. That the man left. Some villagers shook their heads. Others whispered again. The elder's voice hardened. Whether he left or not, responsibility still remains. Joy clenched her hands together. "What responsibility do you mean?" she asked softly. "To respect the values of this community." A woman's voice rose sharply from the crowd. "It is a disgrace." Joy recognized Beatrice Mora immediately. "She walks through the market as if nothing happened." Beatrice continued loudly. "Meanwhile, our daughters are watching." Several women nodded. Joy felt heat rise in her face. She forced herself to speak calmly. "I did not plan this." "But it happened." Beatrice snapped. And now, we all carry the shame. Joy's chest tightened. The child growing inside her shifted slightly as if reacting to her rising stress. Mzee Otieno raised his staff again to quiet the voices. "This gathering is not for shouting," he said sternly. The murmuring slowly faded. Then the elder turned back to Joy. "Our council has discussed this situation," he said. Joy's heart began pounding. "And we believe a decision must be made." "What decision?" Joy asked. "You must either reveal the father of the child, or consider leaving this community until the matter is resolved." A stunned silence followed the statement. Joy felt the ground beneath her feet seem to shift. "Leave," she whispered. "Yes." "But my mother lives here," Joy said. Mzee Otieno's expression remained firm. "Your actions have consequences." Joy's voice trembled. "I did nothing wrong except trust someone who lied to me." A few villagers shifted uncomfortably, but Beatrice spoke again. "Trusting a man without marriage is already wrong." Laughter broke out from several young men. Joy closed her eyes briefly. The humiliation burned through her chest. For weeks she had endured whispers, but hearing the possibility of exile spoken openly felt like a knife twisting deeper. At the edge of the gathering, Daniel Mwangi watched everything silently. He had intended only to observe, to understand the situation before forming an opinion. But the more he listened, the more disturbed he felt. The accusations, the lack of compassion, the assumption that the woman alone carried the entire blame. Daniel stepped forward slightly. "Excuse me," he said calmly. The crowd turned again. Mzee Otieno frowned slightly. "Yes," Daniel spoke respectfully. "May I ask a question?" The elder hesitated before nodding. "Ask." Daniel looked around the circle of villagers. "You say the child's father left." Joy nodded. "Yes." Daniel turned back to the elders. "And yet the punishment is for the woman alone." A murmur passed through the crowd. Mzee Otieno's eyes narrowed slightly. "That is how our traditions work." Daniel remained calm. "But is it fair?" Beatrice scoffed loudly. "Who are you to question our traditions?" Daniel did not look at her. Instead, he kept his gaze on the elder. "I am only asking whether justice should consider the full story." Mzee Otieno straightened slightly. "This community has survived for generations by respecting its values." Daniel nodded. "I respect that, but compassion is also a value." The crowd grew quiet. Joy looked at Daniel in astonishment. No one had spoken on her behalf like this before. Not publicly, not in front of the elders. Mzee Otieno studied the stranger carefully. "You speak as if you know this woman." Daniel answered honestly. "I do not. Then why defend her?" Daniel paused for a moment, because the answer was simple. "Because yesterday I saw her help an elderly woman who had fallen in the rain," he said calmly. Several villagers glanced toward Shosho Akinyi, who stood quietly near the back of the gathering. The old woman raised her hand slightly. "It is true," she said. Joy stared at her in surprise. The crowd began murmuring again. Daniel continued. "Kindness like that deserves recognition, not exile." The elder remained silent for a long moment. Then he spoke slowly. "You are a thoughtful man, visitor, but traditions cannot change overnight." Daniel nodded. "I understand, but perhaps this situation deserves more time before judgment." The elder looked around the crowd. The murmurs were growing again. Some villagers nodded thoughtfully, others frowned. Finally, Mzee Otieno raised his staff once more. "This meeting will continue tomorrow," he declared. "We will consider what has been said." Relief flooded through Joy's chest. For the first time that afternoon, she felt able to breathe again. The crowd slowly began dispersing. Joy remained standing where she was. Daniel turned to leave. But before he walked away, Joy stepped toward him. "Thank you," she said softly. Daniel met her eyes. "You don't need to thank me." "Yes, I do." He smiled slightly. "Then you're welcome." Neither of them realized yet that this moment, the stranger standing beside the woman the village had condemned, would soon change the course of both their lives in ways no one in that square could imagine. News travels faster than bicycles, faster than boda-bodas, faster even than the wind that moves across the green hills of western Kenya. By the time the sun began setting that evening, nearly every household in the village had heard the story. The stranger from the city had spoken during the elders' gathering, and he had defended Joy Kwamboka. For some villagers the moment had been shocking, for others it was infuriating. Inside a small house near the edge of the market road, Beatrice Mora sat with several women around a cooking fire, her voice sharp with irritation. "That man has no right to interfere in our traditions," she said firmly. One woman nodded. "He spoke as if he knew better than our elders." Another leaned closer to the fire, but what he said was not completely wrong. Beatrice turned to her immediately. "Not wrong." The woman shrugged slightly. "Joy did help Shosho Akinyi yesterday." Beatrice waved her hand dismissively. Helping someone once does not erase bad behavior. "But she said the man who made her pregnant left another woman said." Beatrice's expression hardened, and we are supposed to believe that silence fell for a moment. Then Beatrice spoke again. "No, something about this story is not right." Across the village in the small house near the field, Joy sat quietly beside Mama Nyambura. The older woman had listened carefully as Joy described everything that happened at the gathering. When Joy finished, Mama Nyambura remained silent for a long moment. Finally she spoke. "This man, Daniel," she said slowly. "Yes, he spoke for you." Joy nodded. "In front of everyone." Mama Nyambura's eyes softened. "That takes courage." Joy stared down at her hands. "I don't understand why he did it." Her mother smiled gently. "Sometimes people see truth when others are too busy judging." Joy sighed quietly. "I wish the whole village could see that." Mama Nyambura squeezed her daughter's hand. "Maybe they will." But while the village debated the stranger's actions, another figure was already making his way back toward the community. A dusty motorcycle sped along the narrow road leading into the village, its engine roaring loudly through the quiet evening air. The rider wore a faded jacket and dark sunglasses. His name was Brian Uma. Brian had not planned to return. After leaving the village months earlier, he had moved to a nearby town where work was easier, and questions about Joy's pregnancy could not follow him. For a while, life had continued normally, but 2 days earlier, he had received a phone call from an old acquaintance in the village. "You should come back," the man had told him. Brian frowned. "Why, there is a rich man visiting." So the voice on the phone lowered slightly. "He's been talking to Joy." Brian's grip tightened on the phone. "What do you mean?" "I mean people are starting to say things." "What things?" "That maybe the baby has something to do with him." Brian's heart skipped. "That's impossible." "I know that," the man replied, "but rumors are powerful." The line went quiet for a moment. Then the voice added one more sentence. "You might want to come before the story changes too much." Now as Brian rode toward the village again, his thoughts raced. He had never expected Joy's situation to grow complicated. When he left, he assumed the village would simply shame her quietly and move on. But the involvement of a wealthy stranger could change everything. And Brian knew one dangerous truth. If Joy ever decided to speak openly about their relationship, his reputation in nearby towns could be destroyed. He could not allow that. The motorcycle slowed as Brian reached the first houses at the edge of the village. Several children stopped playing and stared. One boy ran ahead toward the market road, shouting excitedly, "Brian is back." Within minutes, word spread quickly. By the time Brian parked near the Boda Boda stage, a small crowd had already gathered. Some men greeted him with curious smiles. "Ah, Brian, long time." Brian forced a relaxed grin. "Work kept me busy." One of the riders leaned closer. "You came back at an interesting time." Brian removed his helmet. "What do you mean you haven't heard?" "Heard what?" The rider laughed. "The whole village is talking about Joy." Brian pretended to look confused. "What about her?" "She is pregnant." Brian shrugged casually. "That is her business, but a rich man from the city is defending her." Brian's expression stiffened. "What rich man?" The rider gestured toward the road. "He arrived yesterday in a big SUV. Another man joined the conversation. They say he even spoke against the elders." Brian's jaw tightened. "Really? Some people think he wants to help her." A third man laughed. "Maybe he already did." The group burst into laughter. Brian forced a smile, but inside his stomach twisted. This situation was becoming dangerous. If the stranger continued defending Joy publicly, villagers might begin asking deeper questions, and eventually those questions could reach him. Brian needed to regain control of the story. That evening, as the sky darkened and lanterns began glowing inside homes across the village, Brian walked slowly toward the house where Joy lived. The path felt strangely familiar after months away. Memories flashed through his mind. Evenings sitting under the stars, Joy's quiet laughter, promises he had spoken easily at the time. For a brief second, guilt flickered inside him, but it vanished quickly. Survival mattered more than regret. When Brian reached the small house near the field, he stopped outside the gate. Light from a small lamp glowed through the window. Inside, Joy and Mama Nyambura were finishing their evening meal. Joy looked up suddenly. "Did you hear something?" Mama Nyambura tilted her head. "Yes." A knock sounded on the wooden door. Joy's heart began pounding. Slowly, she stood and walked toward the entrance. When she opened the door and saw the figure standing outside, the world seemed to freeze. "Brian," she whispered. He gave her the same confident smile she remembered. "Hello, Joy." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Mama Nyambura stepped closer. Her eyes widened immediately. "You!" she said sharply. Brian removed his sunglasses. "I thought it was time to talk." Joy's hands trembled slightly. "You disappeared." Brian shrugged casually. "I had work. You left when I told you about the baby." Brian sighed dramatically. "That is exactly why I came back." Joy felt confusion rising. "What do you mean?" Brian leaned slightly against the doorframe. "I heard some strange rumors in the village," he said calmly, "about a rich man claiming your child." Joy stared at him in shock. "No one said that." Brian smiled faintly. "They will." Then his expression hardened. "And before that happens, we need to decide what story people are going to believe." Joy felt cold fear creep into her chest, because suddenly it was clear. Brian had not returned out of love. He had come back to protect himself, and the storm his return would create was about to shake the entire village even harder than before. The moment Joy Kwamboka saw Brian Uma standing at the doorway, something deep inside her chest tightened. For weeks, she had imagined many possible endings to their story. She had imagined him returning with apologies. She had imagined him sending a message explaining why he disappeared. She had even imagined never seeing him again. But she had never imagined this. Brian standing calmly in front of her house as if nothing had happened. The evening air was quiet except for the distant sounds of insects and the soft rustling of grass in the fields. Inside the house, Mama Nyambura stepped closer to the door. her face hard with anger. "You have no right to come here," she said sharply. Brian lifted his hands slightly. "I only came to talk." "You should have talked months ago," Mama Nyambura replied. Joy remained silent. Her heart was beating fast, but she forced herself to remain calm. "What do you want, Brian?" she asked quietly. Brian glanced toward the road before stepping inside the small yard. "I heard there is trouble in the village," he said. Joy crossed her arms. "You already know that." Brian nodded. "And I also heard about the rich man." Joy's eyes narrowed. "What about him?" Brian leaned casually against the wooden fence. "People say he is defending you." Joy hesitated. "He only spoke during the elders' meeting." Brian studied her carefully. "And what exactly did he say?" "He asked the elders not to judge too quickly." Brian let out a quiet laugh. "So the city man wants to play hero." Joy's patience began to wear thin. "He showed more respect in one day than you did in months." Brian's expression darkened slightly. "You shouldn't compare me to strangers." Joy's voice trembled with controlled anger. "You left. I had reasons. You never told me those reasons." Brian looked away briefly. Then he turned back toward her. "That's why I came." Joy stared at him. "To explain." Brian shook his head, slowly. "To fix the situation." Joy felt confusion rising. What situation? Brian gestured toward her stomach. "This." The word hung heavily in the air. Mama Nyambura stepped forward angrily. "That child is not a problem to be fixed." Brian ignored her. "Listen, Joy," he said calmly. "The village is already talking." Joy laughed bitterly. "They have been talking for months." "Yes," Brian replied. "But now things are changing." "How because of that man?" Joy's voice dropped. "His name is Daniel." Brian shrugged. "Whatever his name is." Joy frowned. "What does he have to do with anything?" Brian leaned closer. "If people start believing he is connected to the baby, your life could change." Joy stepped back. "What are you saying?" Brian's voice lowered slightly. "I'm saying you should let them believe it." Joy stared at him in disbelief. "You want me to lie?" Brian shrugged again. "It's not really lying if people already think it." Mama Nyambura gasped in anger. "You are shameless." Brian turned toward her. "I'm being practical." Joy's chest felt tight with shock. "You disappeared when I needed you," she said slowly. "And now you come back asking me to pretend another man is the father." Brian sighed. "You're missing the point." "Then explain it to me." "If the village believes that rich man is responsible," Brian said calmly, "they'll stop blaming you." Joy shook her head in disbelief. "And what about the truth?" Brian's expression hardened. "The truth is complicated." "No," Joy said firmly. "The truth is simple." She pointed directly at him. "You are the father of this child." The words hung heavily in the air. Brian's jaw tightened. "Lower your voice." "Why?" Joy demanded. "Because neighbors might hear." Mama Nyambura stepped forward again. "Let them hear." Brian raised his hands defensively. "I didn't come here to fight." Joy felt tears burning behind her eyes. "But you came here to hide." Brian's patience was fading. "You think telling everyone I'm the father will solve anything?" "Yes," Joy said quietly. "It will give my child a name." Brian scoffed. "Names don't feed babies." Joy stared at him. "But responsibility does." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Brian's tone changed. It became colder. "You don't understand the situation." Joy crossed her arms. "Then explain it." Brian leaned closer, lowering his voice. "If the village believes I abandoned you, my reputation in nearby towns will be ruined." Joy felt something inside her heart crack. "So this is about you." Brian did not deny it. "It's about survival." Joy laughed bitterly. You already survived when you ran away." Brian's eyes flashed. "Be careful what you say." Joy's voice grew stronger. "I'm done being careful." Mama Nyambura placed a protective hand on Joy's shoulder. Brian looked between them, frustration building. "Listen," he said finally. "The elders are meeting again tomorrow, right?" Joy nodded slowly. "Yes." Brian smiled faintly. "Good." Joy's stomach tightened. "What are you planning?" Brian stepped back toward the gate. "I'm planning to protect myself." Joy's voice sharpened. How Brian placed his helmet back on his motorcycle. "Tomorrow," he said calmly, "I will tell the elders the truth." Joy felt a flicker of hope. "You will admit you are the father." Brian looked at her with a strange smile. "No." Joy's heart dropped. "I will tell them that you tried to trap me." Silence fell over the small yard. Mama Nyambura gasped in shock. Joy's voice came out as a whisper. "You wouldn't!" Brian started the motorcycle. "I would." The engine roared to life. "Because if I don't," he continued, "people might start asking dangerous questions." Joy felt anger and disbelief colliding inside her chest. "You're lying," Brian shrugged. "Maybe." Then he added one final sentence before riding away. "But the village will believe me." The motorcycle sped down the dark road, leaving dust swirling in the air. Joy stood frozen at the doorway. Mama Nyambura wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "My child," she said softly. Joy stared toward the empty road. The fear in her chest was growing, because she understood something clearly now. Tomorrow's meeting with the elders would not just be about shame anymore. It would become a battle of truth against lies, and the entire village would be watching. The night after Brian Uma's visit felt longer than any night Joy Kwamboka could remember. Sleep refused to come. She lay on the thin mattress beside the small window, listening to the quiet sounds of the countryside. The distant barking of dogs, the whisper of wind moving through the grass, and the occasional rumble of a motorcycle passing along the road. But none of those sounds could silence the storm inside her mind. Brian's words repeated again and again. "Tomorrow I will tell the elders the truth." Except it would not be the truth. It would be a lie. A lie strong enough to turn the entire village against her even more than before. Joy placed her hand gently on her stomach. The baby moved slightly beneath her palm. Tears burned in her eyes. "You deserve better than this," she whispered softly. Across the small room, Mama Nyambura sat awake as well. The older woman had not slept either. Her face was tense with worry. "My daughter," she said quietly. "We must be ready for tomorrow." Joy turned toward her. "What can we do?" Mama Nyambura hesitated. "Truth is powerful, but sometimes lies speak louder." Joy's chest tightened. "So we are helpless." "No," her mother said firmly. "We are not helpless." Joy waited. "We must face them with dignity," Mama Nyambura continued. "Even if they refuse to listen." Joy nodded slowly, but deep inside fear was still growing. Because she understood the reality of village politics. Once a lie spread among enough people, it could easily become accepted as fact. Morning arrived, with pale sunlight stretching across the hills. Word about the elders' second meeting had spread quickly overnight. By the time Joy walked toward the market square, villagers were already gathering beneath the large acacia tree. Some stood in small groups whispering. Others waited quietly, curious to see what would happen. Joy felt their eyes following her again, but this time there was something different in their expressions. Suspicion, because rumors about Brian's return had already reached them, and rumors had a way of changing people's attitudes quickly. When Joy reached the tree, she saw Mzee Otieno already standing with the other elders. Brian was there too. He stood near the front of the gathering with his arms crossed, looking calm and confident. When he noticed Joy approaching, he smiled slightly. The sight made Joy's stomach twist. Mama Nyambura stood beside her daughter as they stepped into the circle. The murmuring around them grew louder. Then, Mzee Otieno raised his staff. "Silence," he said firmly. Gradually, the crowd quieted. "We gathered yesterday to discuss the situation concerning Joy Kwamboka," the elder announced. He paused. "Today we will hear additional information." Joy felt her heart pounding. Mzee Otieno turned toward Brian. "Brian Uma," he said, "you asked to speak." Brian nodded respectfully. "Yes, Mzee." He stepped forward into the center of the gathering. Joy watched him carefully. Part of her still hoped, despite everything, that he might change his mind, that he might finally admit the truth. Brian looked around at the villagers. Many of them nodded encouragingly. "Thank you for allowing me to speak," he began calmly. "I returned to the village last night because I heard many troubling rumors." Joy clenched her fists. Brian continued. "People are saying that I am responsible for Joy's pregnancy." A ripple of whispers passed through the crowd. Brian shook his head slowly. "That is not true." Joy felt the words hit her like a physical blow. Mama Nyambura stepped forward angrily. "You liar!" The elders raised their hands. "Let him finish," Mzee Otieno said sternly. Brian continued speaking. "Months ago, Joy and I spoke several times in the market," he admitted. "But she misunderstood my friendliness." Joy stared at him in disbelief. Brian's voice grew louder. "When she told me she was pregnant, she tried to pressure me into claiming the child." Gasps rose from several villagers. Joy's chest tightened painfully. "That's not true," she cried. But Brian continued as if she had not spoken. "When I refused, she became angry." The crowd murmured again. Joy felt her throat burning with frustration. "Brian, stop lying," she shouted. But Brian's voice carried over hers. "I left the village to avoid further conflict," he said calmly. "And now I return to find another man defending her story." He turned slightly toward the road where Daniel's SUV had appeared the day before. "I believe the truth is obvious." The crowd leaned forward. Brian pointed toward Joy. "She is trying to attach responsibility to any man who will listen." A wave of shocked whispers spread through the villagers. Joy felt tears of anger filling her eyes. "That is a lie." But Brian simply shrugged. "Ask yourselves why she refuses to name the father." Mzee Otieno frowned slightly. "Joy," he said slowly. "Is this true?" Joy stepped forward, her voice trembling but strong. "No." She pointed directly at Brian. "He promised to marry me." The crowd murmured again. Brian laughed lightly. "That is imagination." Joy's anger flared. "You know that's not true." But before she could continue, a sudden voice rose from the back of the crowd. "That's enough." The words cut through the gathering like a sharp blade. Every head turned toward the road. Standing beside the dark SUV was Daniel Mwangi. He had arrived quietly only moments earlier, but now he was walking toward the circle of villagers with calm determination. Brian's expression stiffened. Joy felt a wave of relief she could barely explain. Daniel stepped into the gathering. "Good morning," he said respectfully. Mzee Otieno nodded slightly. "You have returned." "Yes." Daniel glanced briefly at Joy, before looking back at the elders. "I believe this conversation is missing something important." The elder raised an eyebrow. "And what is that?" Daniel's voice remained calm. "Evidence," the crowd murmured in confusion. Brian crossed his arms. "What evidence?" Daniel turned toward him. "The truth tends to leave traces," he said quietly. Then he looked back at the elders. "Before we accept accusations, we should ask one simple question." The villagers leaned forward. "What question?" Mzee Otieno asked. Daniel pointed calmly at Brian. If this man claims he had nothing to do with Joy's pregnancy. He paused. Then why did he disappear immediately after she told him? The silence that followed felt heavy enough to stop time. Because suddenly, the villagers realized something. The stranger from the city was not just defending Joy. He was challenging Brian directly. And the truth Brian had tried to bury was beginning to rise toward the surface. A thick silence settled beneath the acacia tree after Daniel Mwangi's question. The entire village seemed to pause at once. Even the wind moving through the leaves above them felt quieter. All eyes turned toward Brian Uma. The confident expression he had worn only moments earlier had begun to fade. For the first time since he arrived at the gathering, uncertainty appeared in his eyes. Mzee Otieno shifted his weight slightly and looked at Brian. "You should answer the question," the elder said calmly. Brian cleared his throat. "I left for work," he replied quickly. Daniel tilted his head slightly. "Work that required disappearing without telling anyone." Brian frowned. "I don't need to explain my movements to strangers." Daniel remained calm. "That is true." He paused. "But when your movements are connected to accusations against someone else, they become relevant." A murmur spread through the villagers. Brian's jaw tightened. "You don't know anything about this situation." Daniel nodded. "That's why I asked a question." The elder looked between them thoughtfully. Brian Mzee Otieno said slowly, "Did Joy tell you she was pregnant before you left the village?" Brian hesitated. It was only a brief pause. But in a small village where people studied every expression closely, that hesitation was impossible to ignore. "Yes," Brian admitted reluctantly. Another wave of murmurs passed through the crowd. The elder raised his staff slightly to quiet them. "And after she told you," he continued, "you left immediately." Brian's voice sharpened. "I already told you I left for work." Daniel spoke again, his tone still calm. "Work that prevented even a simple conversation with the woman you were seeing." Brian glared at him. "You seem very interested in my personal life." Daniel did not react to the hostility. "I'm interested in fairness." Joy stood quietly beside her mother watching the exchange unfold. Her heart was racing. But for the first time in many weeks she felt something unfamiliar rising inside her chest. Hope, because the lies Brian had spoken so confidently were beginning to crack. Behind the crowd, Shosho Akinyi stepped forward slowly. The elderly woman leaned on a walking stick as she approached the circle. "May I speak?" she asked gently. Mzee Otieno nodded respectfully. "Of course." The old woman turned toward Brian. "You say Joy misunderstood your kindness." Brian shifted uncomfortably. "Yes." Shosho Akinyi tilted her head. "That's interesting." Brian frowned. "Why, because I remember something." The villagers leaned closer. Shosho Akinyi continued. "Several months ago, I passed Joy's house one evening." Joy blinked in surprise. "You and Brian were sitting outside together." Brian's eyes narrowed slightly. "That doesn't mean anything." The old woman raised a finger. "I wasn't finished." The crowd quieted again. "You were speaking about marriage." A ripple of surprise moved through the gathering. Joy felt her breath catch. Brian's face hardened. "That is not," Shosho Akinyi continued calmly. "You said you needed time to save money for the wedding." Now the murmurs became louder. Brian's voice rose sharply. "She must be mistaken." But another voice joined from the crowd. "She's not." A middle-aged farmer stepped forward. "I remember seeing them together many times." Several villagers nodded. Yes, they were always walking together after the market. They looked like a couple. Brian's confidence began slipping away visibly. His eyes darted across the gathering. The narrative he had tried to control was suddenly slipping from his hands. Daniel watched quietly. Then he spoke again. "Brian, I have another question." Brian snapped back. "I'm not answering anything else from you." Daniel remained calm. "You don't have to answer me." He looked toward the elders. "You only need to answer them." Mzee Otieno nodded slowly. "That is correct." Brian clenched his fists. "What exactly are you trying to prove?" Daniel's voice remained steady. "I'm trying to understand why the entire burden of this situation has been placed on Joy." The elder's eyes moved thoughtfully between the two men. "You make a fair point," Mzee Otieno admitted. The crowd murmured again. Joy felt tears gathering in her eyes. For weeks she had stood alone against judgment. Now suddenly, the truth was beginning to rise through the voices of people she never expected to defend her. But the moment was not finished. Daniel turned toward Brian one final time. "There is one more thing," he said. Brian scoffed. "Of course there is." Daniel reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. Several villagers leaned forward curiously. When he removed his hand, he was holding a small envelope. Brian's eyes narrowed. "What is that?" Daniel opened the envelope calmly. Inside was a folded piece of paper. He handed it to Mzee Otieno. The elder adjusted his glasses and began reading. The crowd waited in tense silence. After a few seconds, the elder's eyebrows lifted. "Where did you get this?" he asked. Daniel answered simply. "At the local clinic." Brian's face paled slightly. "What is it?" someone in the crowd asked. Mzee Otieno raised the paper so others could see. "This is a clinic record," he said slowly. "It confirms that Joy visited the clinic several months ago with Brian Uma." A shocked gasp rippled through the villagers. Joy stared at the paper in disbelief. She remembered that visit clearly. Brian had insisted on going with her when she first suspected the pregnancy. Brian's voice rose in panic. "That proves nothing," but the elder continued reading. The record also notes that Brian signed as the responsible partner during the consultation. The silence that followed was heavier than anything that had come before. Brian's confident mask shattered completely. His eyes darted across the crowd searching for support. But now the villagers were looking at him very differently. Not with sympathy, but with anger. "You lied to us," one man said. "You tried to destroy her reputation," another added. Beatrice Moray stepped forward slowly, her expression stunned. "Brian, is this true?" Brian's voice trembled. I didn't think it mattered." Joy felt tears finally spill down her cheeks. The truth had surfaced, not through revenge, but through patience. Mzee Otieno folded the paper carefully and handed it back to Daniel. Then he turned toward Brian. "You have dishonored this community," the elder said sternly. Brian lowered his head. The judgment was clear. But before the elder could speak further, Daniel stepped forward once more. The villagers looked at him curiously. There was something calm, yet powerful in his posture. Daniel turned toward Joy. "Joy Kwamboka," he said gently. Joy looked up confused. Daniel took a slow breath. "I came to this village only passing through." The villagers listened intently. But sometimes life brings us to places for reasons we don't understand. He paused. Then he spoke the words that would change everything. "Joy, if you are willing." The entire village held its breath. "I would like to marry you." The silence that followed was so complete that even the birds seemed to stop singing. Joy stared at him in shock. The villagers exchanged stunned glances. Brian looked up in disbelief. And beneath the acacia tree, the story that had begun with shame and accusation suddenly turned into something no one in the village had ever expected. For several long seconds after Daniel Mwangi's words echoed beneath the acacia tree, the entire village stood frozen. No one moved. No one spoke. Even the wind seemed to pause among the leaves above them. Then whispers exploded through the crowd. Did he just say, "Marry her"? That man must be crazy. Or maybe he knows something we don't. Joy Kwamboka felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath her feet. Her heart was beating so loudly, she could barely hear the murmuring around her. She looked at Daniel, searching his face for any sign that this was a misunderstanding. But his expression remained calm, serious, respectful. He was not joking. Across the gathering, Brian Uma stared at him in disbelief. "You can't be serious," Brian said sharply. Daniel glanced at him briefly. "I am." Brian laughed nervously. "You don't even know her." Daniel's voice remained steady. "I know enough." Joy finally found her voice. "Why?" she asked softly. Every villager leaned closer. The question hung in the air like a fragile thread. Daniel looked directly at her. "Because character matters more than reputation." The crowd murmured again. Joy felt tears burning behind her eyes. "You saw me for only a few moments," she said. Daniel nodded. That was enough to see something important. He gestured gently toward the villagers. "You stood alone while others judged you." Joy's chest tightened. "But many people stand alone," she whispered. Daniel continued calmly. "Yes. But not everyone keeps their dignity when that happens." He looked briefly toward Shosho Akinyi. "You helped someone who had fallen even when no one would help you." Joy remembered the moment in the rain. "That was nothing," she said quietly. Daniel shook his head. "It was everything." The villagers listened in stunned silence. Daniel turned toward the elders. "Joy has been judged for a mistake." He paused, but the man responsible for that mistake tried to destroy her instead of protecting her. Brian's face flushed with anger. "You think marrying her will solve everything?" Daniel met his gaze calmly. "No." Brian sneered. "Then why do it?" Daniel answered simply. "Because she deserves respect." Those words settled over the gathering like quiet thunder. For weeks, the village had spoken about shame, about dishonor, about punishment. But almost no one had spoken about respect. Joy's eyes filled with tears again. Her voice trembled slightly. "You don't owe me anything." Daniel nodded. "That's true, but sometimes doing the right thing has nothing to do with obligation." Joy looked down at the ground. Her mind felt overwhelmed. For months she had lived inside a world of humiliation, a world where every whisper reminded her she had been abandoned. And now suddenly, a man she barely knew was offering something unimaginable. Not pity, not charity, but dignity. Still, something inside her hesitated. Joy slowly lifted her head. "I cannot accept your proposal today," she said quietly. The crowd gasped. Even Daniel looked slightly surprised. Joy took a steady breath. "You came here with kindness," she continued, "and you defended me when no one else did." Daniel listened carefully. But marriage is not something that should happen because of a moment of sympathy. The villagers murmured again. Joy's voice grew stronger. "I have already trusted one promise that was not real." Brian flinched at the words. Joy continued. "If I ever marry someone, it must be because we truly understand each other." She looked directly into Daniel's eyes. "And that takes time." For a moment, the entire square remained silent. Then Daniel smiled slightly. Not with disappointment, but with admiration. "That is a wise answer," he said. Joy blinked in surprise. "You're not angry?" Daniel shook his head. "Not at all." He looked around the crowd. "In fact, it proves I was right." Joy frowned slightly. "About what? That your strength is real." The tension in the gathering slowly began to soften. Mzee Otieno stepped forward again. The elder looked at Joy thoughtfully. "For many days this village has spoken harshly about you," he said slowly. Joy waited. "But today we have learned something important." He glanced toward Brian. "That the truth is not always what it first appears to be." Several villagers nodded quietly. Beatrice Mora lowered her eyes, clearly uncomfortable. Mzee Otieno raised his staff once more. "From this moment forward," he declared, "Joy Kwamboka will not be treated as an outcast in this community." A wave of surprised murmurs passed through the crowd. The elder continued, "The father of the child has been identified." He looked firmly at Brian. "And responsibility will fall where it belongs." Brian's shoulders sagged slightly. Joy felt a weight lifting from her chest that she had carried for months. For the first time since the gossip began, she felt the village's judgment beginning to loosen. Daniel stepped back toward his vehicle. Before leaving, he turned to Joy once more. "I meant what I said earlier," he told her quietly. Joy nodded. "I know, and I will be in the region for a while." Joy smiled faintly. "Then maybe we will have time to talk." Daniel returned the smile. "I would like that." The villagers watched as he entered the SUV. The engine started, and the vehicle slowly drove away down the dusty road. Joy stood beneath the acacia tree beside her mother. Mama Nyambura wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "My daughter," she whispered softly. Joy leaned into the embrace. The path ahead was still uncertain. She still carried a child. She still faced challenges. But something fundamental had changed. For the first time since Brian disappeared, Joy no longer felt alone. And somewhere beyond the hills, a man who believed in her strength had just become part of her story. The village would remember this day for many years. The day shame turned into truth. And the day hope quietly returned to the life of Joy Kwamboka. Sometimes the world is quick to judge the people who fall. Communities, families, and even strangers often decide someone's story before hearing the full truth. But life has a quiet way of revealing character over time. Joy Kwamboka's story reminds us of something powerful. A person's worst moment does not define their entire life. What matters more is how they carry themselves through hardship. Joy faced humiliation, gossip, and betrayal. Yet she never allowed bitterness to destroy her kindness. And in the end, it was that kindness shown even in the middle of a storm that changed everything. Justice did not arrive through revenge. It arrived through truth, through courage, and through someone willing to see beyond the noise of judgment. Perhaps the real lesson is this: the world may sometimes shame those who fall, but it will always respect those who rise with dignity. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to share your thoughts. Tell us in the comments. What would you have done if you were in Joy's situation? And if you believe stories like this, remind us to treat others with compassion. Like the video, share it with someone who needs encouragement, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next powerful story. Because somewhere in the world right now, another story of courage is waiting to be told.